Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar topic, Managing OPEB Costs and Other Liabilities in a Tumultuous Fiscal Environment. My name is James Collins. I'm the Senior Director the Director of Business Development here at CSBA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. We will be recording today's webinar, and everyone will receive a link to the recording as well. If you have any questions for our panelists, please submit using the Q&A button. Please do not use the chat function. We will go through all of your questions at the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions after the close of the webinar, you can always email us at csba@csba.org. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's discussion. First up, Dennis Myers, an Assistant Executive Director here at Government Relations here at CSBA. Dennis will be discussing the May revision to the governor's budget, and Rachel Sanders, Vice President at PARS. Rachel will discuss trends and best practices for addressing OPEB and pension liabilities. At this time, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Great. Thank you, James, and welcome, Rachel, and welcome, everybody. Appreciate everyone tuning into this. Interesting is, the connection between what Rachel's going to talk about and what I'm going to talk about is just, it's so intricately related. But let's start with what's in the governor's May revision, and I'll do a little bit of prognostication about where we might see things happen in the state budget so that you as school board members and superintendents and others can really be thinking about this next month as you start piecing your budget together. So just starting overall, with the governor's May revision, the recognition by the governor that things have gotten slightly worse for the state general fund, starting with the January level discussion of a deficit of about $22.5 billion. And then coming back into the May revision to just recognize that it's gotten worse to about 31.5. The governor also, as sure as he is at that moment in time, 2 weeks ago, there are still some things that are really up in the air. What happens with the federal debt ceiling? Do we default? Do we not default? What would the impact be on markets? The delayed tax filing deadline of October 15th. The IRS moved the tax filing deadline for 51 of our 58 counties to October 15th, and the state then just conformed with the same. So that just means there's so much that is unknown between right now and then I'll say late October, because October 16th and 17th and 18th is when the state is going to be looking at what those final filings are. And so we're really not going to know until probably the end of October what the, almost a third of the way into that fiscal year, how things are really finally shaping up. And then there's just the economic uncertainties about interest rates, whether they go up, whether they go down, bank failures, do they continue, do they stop? And then just everyone is always worried about, is there a recession looming? And I just kind of chuckled about that because for the past 10 years, 12 years of economic growth that we've seen, every moment we say, is there going to be a recession? So we do know that there will be a recession coming. Will it be next week or 2 or 3 years from now? We don't know. But that just gives the uncertainty that the governor is dealing with and the legislature is dealing with as they put together the budget, which obviously then probably it also gives us a little bit of uncertainty as well because of the way the Prop 98 guarantee works. Next slide, please. So let's kind of delve into just a quick look at the state general fund. You can see, the state looks at state budgeting like you do in county offices and in school districts. They look back a year to close out that year, and then they adjust in the current year and then project into the next fiscal year. So that's what this 3-year look is. And you can see the big adjustment there is in the current year. So the adopted budget is the purple line. And then the January budget is the yellow line. That's what the governor's budget is, the January budget. Then the May revision is the red line. So you can see how the governor has had to adjust in the current year just between January and May as things have gotten worse. And then when we talk about this $31 billion problem, it's the difference between that in the current year and then projecting that into the next year. So that's how you just add up the deficits to get to the $31 billion. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for Proposition 98? Obviously, since we are in a test 1 year, and we're likely to be in test 1 for the forthcoming future, the issue is with test 1 is that is a specific percentage of the state general fund. So when the state general fund goes up or goes down, we share in better times and in worse times based on what that percentage is. And so that's what's happening now. And so that's what we're going to talk about in a second, about what's going on with the state general fund. Just to note that our share of the general fund is actually going up a few tenths of a percent. This is because of the continued rollout of the transitional kindergarten program. So we're adding a couple of months at a time over a few years. And one of our big victories over the past couple of years was getting the governor and the legislature to realize that, hey, this is a new grade level. These are students that are not in the Proposition 98 guarantee. So they are rebenching the guarantee each of the years. The state, we expected more students to actually enroll in transitional kindergarten a few years back, and they're not showing up now. So the actual increasing of that share is slightly lower than we thought, and it's just because that fewer students are actually enrolling in the program. A couple of things just to note is that at the bottom there you can see the Prop 98 guarantee, and at the bottom there we just note what the K-12 share is at, because whenever we talk about the guarantee, just know that's K-14, and so we just want you to know that basically it's about 89% is the K-12 share. We just call it the 89-11 split. And so that just, if you're ever wondering how it works, that's it. Just multiply that number by 89% and you'll see what the K-12 share is. Next slide, please. So now looking just at Prop 98. So this kind of mirrors what we saw in the general fund slide a couple slides ago, but here's what it looks like. So closing out the prior fiscal year, closed out just, a couple of $100 million above, which is always good. And you can see the adjustments that are being made really are in the current year that then flow into the next fiscal year. But you can see the adopted budget there in the dark blue. And then the differences between the January budget and the May revision are significant, and, causing the governor to propose more reductions in the current year, to bring the Prop 98 guarantee down. Next slide, please. So some of the good news here, the governor is proposing to fully fund statutory COLA. Anything different would require a law to be passed, because this is kind of just automatic unless the legislature and the governor do something different. So the COLA is actually just slightly above what was projected in January. The governor fully proposed to fully fund that. You may have heard some issues with the legislative analysts coming out with some different numbers. And while they're saying, hey, to the governor, hey, governor, we think you're too optimistic in state general fund, they also are suggesting legislative action to actually lower the COLA. Very unlikely that would happen. We're seeing in the Senate version and the Assembly version to adopt this, which is important, because the attempt here is to stay committed to ongoing programs as much as possible. And then we'll see in just a second, the reductions that are being proposed are to one-time money. We know that those still cause problems, but the governor is thinking, let's reduce one-time money to protect ongoing based programs. So you can see that the COLA also applies to county offices of education, and then all of the categoricals that have a statutory COLA, including special education. We have a slide on that. And then interesting to note too, for the first time ever, that COLA is being applied to the home to school transportation add-on that is in your local control funding formula. And for the first time ever, there is provision in law to fund 60% of your home to school transportation approved costs. And that also has a COLA on it. You won't see that mentioned anywhere in like the governor's slides and things like that, mainly because it's just what we call continuously appropriated. So as a result of CSBA's efforts to get AB 2933 from last year, it all got put into the budget. Continuous appropriation was adopted. So it's just an automatic thing that goes out the door unless statute changes. And so just know that home to school transportation there's two pieces of that are included in the COLA. Next slide. This here, we borrowed this, I'll say borrowed. Our source for this is the Budget Perspectives Workshops. That's a series of workshops going on right now that we co-sponsor with Capital Advisors. And so we just took this slide to just give you an idea of when I talk about statutory COLA, that's what's included on that right-hand column. So statutory COLA means in the education code, these specific programs are listed to receive cost of living increases. The ones on the left-hand side, there's no mention of it. So it would require an additional effort in the legislature to do a cost of living for any one or all of those. And so far, the governor's not proposing any COLA for anything on the left-hand side, but then staying fully committed to the statutory COLA on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. With the Proposition 98 reserve account, we see that amount in the governor's budget actually increasing. And the reason why between January and May, the governor is looking at, they're estimating that capital gains income on the high income earners is growing at a pretty fast rate, faster than the state general fund, which then requires contributions to the Prop 98 reserve. This is an issue that the legislative analyst differs with, so there will be some discussion on this. But worst case scenario is that there would be a larger contribution to this account. The reason why I say worst case scenario is because a contribution to this is actually it's a cost to the Prop 98 guarantee. So as the Prop 98 guarantee is coming down, one of the requirements would be a contribution to this account, and then the governor is staying committed to ongoing programs. You can see those are the two things that are causing cost pressures within Proposition 98 as they're attempting to adjust it down. And then of course the school district reserve cap is triggered again. So that it means that if you are not a small school district, we got you exempted. If you're not a basic aid school district, because we got you exempted, then you have a cap on reserves at 10%. And what counts toward that is your assigned and unassigned reserves. Those are reserves that accumulate just through, I'm just going to say, let's say unspent monies, then that, like the superintendent or the chief business official will then just put that in a different account. So we didn't spend this here, so we're going to put this in this reserve. That's just being assigned or designated by staff. But the most important thing is committed funds do not count against that 10%. So that's a list that the school board adopts. And the second thing that doesn't account towards that is what our next presenter is going to talk about, is when money is specifically set aside for future costs, whether it's pensions or healthcare costs, things like that. So we'll talk about that. Everything that Rachel's going to be talking about would then not count as well. So this is a point in time to be looking at your reserves. The uncertainty that is in Prop 98, which I'm going to get to in a minute, is another thing to look at with your reserves. And then also think of a wiser place to put your reserves through board action could be for some of your future costs. So just kind of make note of that and make sure that the superintendents and school boards are talking about the best way to I'll say design use of your reserves. Next slide. One thing we do is we also borrowed this too from the Budget Perspectives Workshops, is as you're looking forward, as we're talking about uncertainties, this doesn't show too much uncertainty, because the good news here is that in 23-24 we know what the CalSTRS rate is going to be for employers, and we now know what the CalPERS rate is going to be for employers. And so what we don't show here is any state assistance that we had in a couple of prior, I think it was like 2 years ago. where state general fund money actually bought down these rates by about 2 percentage points, which was amazing assistance. That's not proposed in this budget. So the certainty is in 23-24, as you can see, and there's kind of flattened out at 19.1% for CalSTRS. And then you can see the increase continuing year to year, especially between current year and next year in CalPERS. And then what's unknown is where CalPERS will go in 24, 25, 25, 26. But we do expect them to increase at least by these amounts, which is, more than a point in each year. So again, this is another thing to be thinking about as far as your use for reserves. While there's uncertainty in Proposition 98, we're counting pretty much on CalPERS going up at least by a point a year. And then CalSTRS as well, kind of flattening out at 19.1. But nonetheless, this is a good place to think about your reserves. Next slide, please. So looking at just kind of a little bit more of where the governor's heading, we'll run through these pretty quickly here. Next slide, please. The first thing is I'm going to say good news. Good news is that CSBA and the County Superintendents Association are working together on stabilizing funding for juvenile court and community schools. This was a part of AB 906 that we were co-sponsoring. That bill is parked on the Assembly side while the legislature or the governor put this into the governor's May revision, which is exciting because the commitment there is for $80 million to equalize funding up for court and community schools. These are obviously students who are, in and out of the court and community school program, and to make sure that county offices kind of have just a baseline of funding so that as students go in and out, the infrastructure that's needed to run that program is in place and steady. So this for us is great news. It's still taking a lot of work to make sure this happens. While the governor's proposed it, so far on the Senate side, they've adopted this proposal, but on the Assembly side, they're putting trailer bill language in that punts it out a couple of years, ties it to future legislation that really tightens up accountability. So, most of you, I think, we're about, you will see an alert from CSBA and from the county superintendents urging all of you to call your legislators to reject the Assembly proposal because we want to try to protect this funding. And so you'll see that's good news, but we still have to protect it. The next slide shows a proposal by the governor on the cuts to current year one-time funding. And this is where the uncertainty is. So as I showed that slide where Prop 98 is coming down, what the governor is proposing to do is to reduce the Prop 98 guarantee in the current year as it's coming down, and then to reduce Prop 98 funding that's within that guarantee, just the one-time money. So what he's proposing is going into the arts and music instruction materials discretionary block grant that I think everyone received on a per ADA basis. Half of that money has not gone out yet to you. Most of you have either already spent it or have designs on spending that very soon. But at the state level, they said, oh, we didn't send that out yet. And so he's proposing holding back the second half of that and not sending that out to you. The second thing is a new cut to another one-time grant. And this is about a 32% reduction to what's known as a Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant. That went out to LEAs based on kind of the unduplicated pupil count. And so not everybody got the same amount on that, but the governor's looking and saying, hey, 32% of that didn't go out. Let's hold that back too. So while that, works at the state level to score the Proposition 98 guarantee down, we know that creates a lot of cash flow issues for school districts and county offices. Most likely the state can't pass legislation in time to maybe just not send that money out. So if it does go out, they would somehow reduce like future apportionments. So just know that as you're looking at cash flow, that while you may have had designs on spending these revenues, it's likely that some reductions will be made. the governor's proposal on the Senate and the Assembly have both adopted different levels of reductions to these programs. So we do know that's going to be on the table and that we can expect some reduction to these programs to be adopted in the final budget. But right now, we're not sure exactly much. It won't get any worse than what the governor's proposing, but nonetheless, there will likely be reductions in these programs as well. And the reason why, the governor is doing this is to stay committed to the base programs. So, it's special education, it's the nutrition program, it's LCFF, because those are ongoing commitments. And so they're just trying to reduce, current year obligations this way. Next slide, please. So on universal transition to kindergarten, UTK, as I mentioned earlier, it continues the state's commitment to roll this out 2 months at a time, and then to bump up the Prop 98 guarantee based on these new students, which is great news, obviously. So that's what's noted here. There's also a proposal to pull back on the statutory requirement to lower the adult to student ratio. So there's the proposal is to delay that because we know that would require more staffing requirements, and as difficult as it is to find staff right now, the administration recognizes that and then is proposing right now to keep the staffing ratio at 1 to 12 and not let it go to 1 to 10. So more on that. There's actually legislation on the Assembly side to require this to happen. Most groups are opposing that, and the governor's on the side right now of just let's delay that because of just the difficulties of implementing. Next slide, please. Special education, I alluded to this earlier. The COLA is fully funded, which is always good. There's additional trailer bill language. You'll see this in the slides, but there's additional trailer bill language that requires SELPAs to put money out to member districts, to keep the same amount paying out to them between fiscal years. The newest version of trailer bill language would recognize declining enrollment, so it's not just the straight dollar amount; it's the straight dollar amount factoring in declining enrollment. So it would reduce what SELPAs are putting back into their member districts. So just to know that, but the main thing here is that special education is fully funded and that it does include a COLA. Next slide, please. We just continue to talk about this. This is something that's really important. I know, everybody is really excited about this. The governor's commitment was to do universal meals unless the federal government allowed it. So the federal government is unlikely to extend anything on universal meals. So the deal was that the state would do it until the federal government stepped in. So the state is committed to continuing funding for universal school meals. So that is actually, exciting news too, because we know that has been a successful program that we learned from COVID. One of the good things walking out of COVID is that how important school nutrition became. And so the attempt is to continue doing that then for all students, which is exciting. Next slide, please. I'm not going to cover this too much because in your planning, I think so far what I've talked about as far as Prop 98, COLA, LCFF, Prop 98 Reserve, Special Ed, it really is the nutshell of what you need to kind of plan forward into your budget. So you could read the details on this later, but the governor does stay committed to what we call the LCFF equity multiplier. And this is an attempt to steer resources and also kind of the LCAP discussion around what to do with services to California's lowest performing student group, which right now is African-American students. So the governor is staying committed to this. And so stand by for more information on this. But this is probably not something that you need for budget adoption here in the next 30 days. Next slide, please. Same thing here. This is just a note that discussions about a legislation, SB 691, to require dyslexia screening has turned into a proposal by the governor to include screening for reading which would obviously then identify dyslexia, the students with dyslexia. But the attempt is to put $1 million at the state level right now to very quickly come up with assessments that can be used by LEAs. And then the mandate that's included in SB 691 would also be included in budget trailable language. So it's to speed up identification of resources, but then the mandate would be in place without funding. So we still have those concerns, but nonetheless, this is something that is not in legislation anymore. It's being brought into the state budget. Next slide, please. Same thing here. You can read this slide later because there are just some modest changes to some of the teacher retention programs. And so we'll just, we won't come back to this, but when we email you this slide deck, you can read through that. Next slide. So as we, just closing out my part, the uncertainty in the budget right now really is what happens in October, November, December, January, when actual tax receipts come in on personal income and corporate income tax. So you kind of need to be ready in January-ish in your 23-24 budget, just in case there are mid-year reductions, just in case there are maybe the reinstitution of apportionment deferrals where things are delayed into the next fiscal year. So just managing cash flow is something you need to be aware of as you adopt your budget over the next 30 days and adjust it into the fall. Both of those actions will happen before we know what actual revenue is going to be in that next fiscal year. So just be really, really cautious, which is why we want, you thinking about it. And then next up, we're going to have Rachel Sanders from PARS to talk about investments that you can make with your reserves.
All right, great. Thank you, Dennis, and enjoyed hearing all of that great information. So I'm hopeful that this next set of slides and topic that we're going to cover is going to be a nice complement to what Dennis just shared with you when you're thinking about the budget. Now looking forward to some tools that you may want to consider as you're navigating through some of these challenges. So we're first going to start by talking about some of the latest trends for OPEB. And for those that are unfamiliar with OPEB, let me start by just defining OPEB. OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. And these are benefits that may be offered by your district. Not every district offers them, but they're effectively benefits other than pensions that state and local governments may provide to retired employees. These typically come in the form of retiree health care or medical benefits. Now, another quick point I want to define before I start using it in some of my subsequent slides is GASB 75. So GASB is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and GASB 75 specifically is the required national standard for how you account for those OPEB or retiree healthcare accounting on your financial reports. So when I mention GASB 75, again, that's going to speak to the accounting practices for OPEB. So let's move to the next slide. And now I will kind of give a brief overview of the latest trends in OPEB. So when it comes to offering OPEB and how districts are dealing with this topic, there's really a variety of ways that districts are dealing with it, and those are listed out here. So I would say the most common practice that districts employ is number one, which is the pay-as-you-go method. Effectively, the pay-as-you-go method means paying those retiree medical expenses as they come due. You're pulling money directly from your general fund, and again, just dealing with that when you need to. Another way that some districts deal with OPEB is by setting up a specific general fund reserve fund for those OPEB costs within their general fund. So in this case, because it's a specific reserve fund, those funds are earmarked for OPEB, but they're still in your general fund. And then what we're really going to focus on in today's conversation is the third option for OPEB, and that is trust prefunding into a 115 trust. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this third option, and I want to fully explain what those benefits are. So let's move to the next slide if we can, please. So let me first by explaining what a 115 trust is for those that may not be familiar with it. A 115 trust is really a vehicle that can be used by any school district or other local government to address any essential liabilities, including OPEB or retiree medical, as well as pension. And so this illustration shows you one type of 115 trust. This one is a combination trust. I will note that PARS actually partners with CSBA on the OPEB program within this trust. And then we do also have a pension account available for those wishing to address their STRS and PERS costs. So we're first going to focus on the OPEB side of the trust. I will mention that OPEB prefunding has been around since about 2004. That was when the first school district started doing it. And since then has certainly grown tremendously in the state of California. A 115 trust program allows your district to set money aside into an account that is dedicated and irrevocable specifically for OPEB costs. So what that means is that once you move money out of your general fund and into an OPEB trust or OPEB account within a combo trust, it really ensures that that money is now set aside and dedicated to just be used for OPEB expenses. You're certainly still able to reimburse either your general fund when you need to for those annual OPEB costs, or even, have your provider send that on to whichever provider is doling out those retiree medical benefits. But again, you're ensuring that it's there for that dedicated purpose. And on the flip side, for districts that want to set money aside for STRS and PERS liabilities, similar concept. Once you set money aside into the pension account, it is dedicated then to only be used for future pension costs, meaning you could reimburse your general fund for your STRS and PERS annual costs, or have those sent on directly to STRS and PERS when the time comes. So again, there's different ways to use the trust, but certainly a lot of good advantages that we'll continue to speak to as we move forward here. All right, so let's start by focusing in on OPEB, as I mentioned, and this is actually a district that PARS has worked with. So these are their real numbers. I don't want to go too far into the weeds. I know it's after lunch, but let me just quickly mention, for those not familiar with an actuarial valuation, it's essentially a report that districts who do have OPEB liabilities get completed every 2 years by an actuary, and they provide you with your latest liability numbers so that you know exactly where your liabilities are. So what I want to show you on this page is we've removed the name of the district, but this is the district that starting in 2011 decided to set up an OPEB trust. So what you're looking at in that first column, the pay-as-you-go column, is what their valuation looked like in 2011. You can see they had close to $17 million in OPEB liabilities. They were not pre-funding anything, so they had zero assets set aside for this. And so their funded ratio was 0 when we're looking at financials. The reason why I like to point this out is because GASB 75, going back to that accounting standards, does require districts to put their net OPEB liability on their financial sheets. So, if this was back in 2011 and nothing had changed, basically this district would not have anything to show for a net OPEB liability. It would be the exact same figure as their total OPEB liability. So let's now look at what they've done since pre-funding. So I will add this district actually modified their OPEB benefits. They significantly reduced them. And so that certainly had a part in looking at their total OPEB liability on the top line there, but it did go down to just shy of 7 million. So that's a combination of changing their OPEB benefits, but also pre-funding. I'll tell you why. Not only that, they've now set aside close to 6 million into a 115 trust, which brings their net OPEB liability, that third line down, to about 780,000. And when you compare that to about 17 million where they were just within the decade, that's pretty incredible, because now they're just about 90% funded on their OPEB, and that's a great number to show on their financials. So what is the impact of this? Well, not only do you get to show that decreased net OPEB liability on your financials, I also quickly want to draw your attention to the discount rate. When this district was doing the pay-as-you-go method, they were getting a 3% discount rate. That's because an actuary tends to assign you something that's really in line with what your expected rate of return is on your funds. So when you're using the pay-as-you-go method, as many of you on this call may know, general funds are restricted in terms of how you can invest. So the rate of return expectation is really quite low. Now, once you move money out of a general fund and into a 115 trust, you get the benefit of investing in portfolios that do have some level of stock exposure. And because of that, your rate of return potential goes up. And in this case, the district's rate of return potential went up to 5%. So as the rule of thumb at the bottom of this page states, for every 1% you increase the discount rate, that unfunded liability is actually lowered by 10 to 12%. So there's really meaningful and substantial reasons to pre-fund for that reason alone. You get the benefit of showing a positive number on your financials, and it also makes a very large impact on those ongoing actuarial valuations you have to do. So let's move to the next slide, please. And I just briefly want to talk about some misconceptions. I know, oftentimes when districts are thinking about, should I pre-fund in a 115 trust or should I just leave my funds where they are in the general fund? Sometimes districts get spooked about locking their money up. And so, I just kind of want to run through some of the biggest red flags that we hear from districts and put those myths to bed. So number one, I can lower my liability by putting money in the general fund. I mentioned one of the ways to address OPEB is to create a separate reserve fund within your general fund. And unfortunately, that does not offset your net OPEB liability. So that does not have a direct impact on your net OPEB liability in your financials, nor does it impact your actuarial reports. The only way to do that is to move money into a 115 trust, that dedicated irrevocable fund outside of your general fund. Number two, if I set up a pre-funding trust, I am obligated to make regular contributions. Not true. We've worked with a number of districts that have moved one-time funds into the 115 trust and haven't put any money in since. So there's certainly no minimum requirement. Districts certainly run the gamut in terms of how they use 115 trusts. And really, it's all about flexibility and using a trust in a way that best meets your district-specific objectives. And finally, number three, if I set up a pre-funding trust, the money will be stuck there, even if I eliminate OPEB benefits. Again, also not true. And the example I just gave, even though they didn't eliminate OPEB benefits, they changed their OPEB benefits. And even if your district were to eliminate OPEB benefits altogether, a 115 trust is set up to allow any monies left over in the trust to revert back to a district's general fund when there are no longer any beneficiaries to the plan. So it's not locked up there. It's just there for your use in the future when you do want to make those OPEB costs. But if there are no future OPEB costs, ultimately that money would revert right back to your general fund. All right. So switching gears to pensions, since this is another liability that you can certainly address within a 115 trust. And Dennis already showed you some of these numbers. So just to reiterate what Dennis already mentioned, when we're looking at future CalSTRS and CalPERS liabilities, CalSTRS you'll see is the red line on this graph, and you can see in that left-hand column on this chart as well. CalSTRS has been statutorily set. And so as Dennis noted on his slide, while the state does have some flexibility to potentially move that up or down by 1 percentage point in a given year, it relatively is flatlining in the out years. On the other hand, CalPERS is actuarially set. We've seen a lot more fluctuation on the CalPERS side, and you can see here really how dramatically CalPERS especially has increased over time. But, I think it goes without saying, when you look at this chart, both CalSTRS and CalPERS over the last decade or so and where they're projected to go are significantly rising. And so really the message here is your district preparing for these rising pension costs? And will you have money set aside to deal with this potentially down the road? Governor's budget did not include any pension relief. So again, districts are really starting to think more about prudently pre-planning for these rising costs. Next slide, please. And we have another sample district's information here that we pulled. Your district may look different than this, but this basically is one district's impact as shown by both the STRS and PERS rates over time. So you can see where they were at in 2021-22 fiscal year end, about 11.6 million, and they're expected to see pension costs increasing to about 14.7 million by fiscal year 25-26. This dynamic is not unique to this district. So again, when we're looking forward at how pension costs are really going to affect budgets, it's important for your district to start thinking about that too. And the next slide goes over really the main reasons about why to start thinking about pre-funding liabilities. So again, I know, the May revise may not be the rosiest outlook, but it really is, even as we're moving toward more potentially tumultuous times in the budget or in the economy, it's really important to think about what steps you can take today to prepare for tomorrow's realities. So number one speaks exactly to that point. The creation of a rainy day fund can be so pivotal for districts. Really just having an account that is dedicated to either your OPEB or your pension costs so that you can tap into those monies if and when you need them in difficult times can really be a lifesaver. If we do fall off a fiscal cliff at some point, you know that you have funds that are there for that dedicated purpose, and you're really ensuring that those benefits are going to be there for your employees long term. We think about addressing long-term costs. OPEB costs and STRS and PARS costs have all continued to rise over time. So we look at inflation, we look at how these rising costs impact budgets. Again, having these dedicated accounts can really help you stabilize those costs over time. Addressing liabilities, I talked about what that looks like on OPEB and really being able to put your net OPEB liability on your balance sheet. Again, a lot of folks also setting aside pension funds will include a footnote on their balance sheet for those pension funds. So this is something that's really prudent to do. Go to the next slide. I mentioned this, but I do think it's important to reiterate, this gives you a chance to retain your benefits. While some districts have no choice but to reduce or even eliminate their OPEB benefits, those that have a plan in place, like using an OPEB trust, are really giving themselves a fighting chance to make sure those benefits are there for their employees long term. So this is really something that's good for both the district in terms of financial planning, but also the district's employees for long-term health of these plans. And I'll actually end with number 7. I'll mention the credit rating. We've known a lot of districts that maybe go out for bonds or are looking to get a higher credit rating. They have actually seen higher credit ratings through these pre-funding trusts because credit agencies do view this as something financially prudent, and so will oftentimes give you the benefit of a higher credit rating. And then one of the most important things I'll mention is the ability to achieve a greater rate of return on your money. I mentioned this with OPEB, and it goes for pension pre-funding as well. Being able to diversify how you invest these liabilities that you set aside money for outside of what you can do in your general fund or the county treasury pools is so important because, again, you're really restricted to how you can invest in your general fund. And once you move monies into a 115 trust, there's different California government code sections that apply that allow you to now invest in portfolios that do have some level of stock exposure and really give you the opportunity to help grow those assets over time because of those greater potential for return on investment. Okay, next slide. And speaking of that potential for greater rate of return, I think this slide perfectly illustrates that concept. So as you can see here, our particular 115 trust has 4 different investment options available, and most 115 trust providers will offer you an array of options depending upon anything from your risk tolerance of the district to your time horizon, your objectives for using the trust. But here's an example of what you might see. Your district could certainly, like a lot of the advantages of OPEB, but not want to take any investment risk, and that's okay. That's why there's a fixed income option. Fixed income option is going to be more similar to what you're doing in your general fund. Now, most districts, I will say, tend to gear towards some of these other strategies that do have a level of equity or otherwise known as stock exposure. So starting with the most conservative, have about 40% exposure to stocks and or equity. And then as we move up, we next go to balance, which has about 60%, all the way up to growth with 75%. So certainly districts maybe with a longer time horizon in mind might want to take on a little more risk in their portfolio for the benefit of higher expected rates of return over time. And I know it probably looks tiny on the screen, but beneath each of these strategies, you can really see the benefit of pre-funding and being able to invest, because even the 5-year expected returns, when we're comparing to what you could probably get in your general fund, look pretty phenomenal at this point. For the most conservative strategy, Vanguard is projecting about 5.7% over the next 5 years. That increases over 10 years, and at 30 years, they're looking at over 6% for the most conservative strategy, and it can certainly go up from there. So again, a lot of good things to think about when you're thinking about the benefits of diversifying. Next slide. So let's talk about some sample funding policies. So now that we've set the stage for what a 115 trust is and some reasons that you might want to think about doing it, I know a lot of districts like the concept, but may not know where to start in terms of actually setting money aside. So these are actual policies that we've seen from other districts and public agencies in terms of how they set money aside. So I want to run you through some of the more common themes that we do tend to see. A lot of districts will determine, at the end of each fiscal year when they're doing their budget, basically what their ending balance looks like, and if they have the ability to move funds aside. If they do have a healthy budget, potentially they decide they want to contribute a percentage of that each year into the trust. Now, you certainly don't have to set forth a policy like that, but it is one way to continue contributing if that would make sense in your district. We've seen other districts basically decide to set aside a full year of their pension costs, allowing anytime access to 1 year's worth of pension costs, plus hopefully interest earnings at that point in time, just so again, you have that rainy day fund concept in mind. The idea of stabilizing costs. Some districts will do projections to see what it looks like if they want to stabilize their, their pension costs into future years. And so those types of calculations can be done to help you determine how much money is set aside. And number 4 is, we're talking about potentially a reduction in the one-time funds that are coming through the budget. That has certainly always been something that districts have looked to potentially move monies into the trust. So I know, as Dennis had mentioned, the arts trailer bill, that was something that we had been promoting before because it was unrestricted in terms of how you could use that. That was something you could actually move into a 115 trust for OPEB and pensions. So for districts that potentially haven't decided what to do with that money yet, certainly something to consider here if a 115 trust makes sense for you. Next slide. Some districts, focus on pre-funding both OPEB and pension. So, they may focus on getting to a certain funding level with OPEB first, and then that determines how much they set aside for pension, or maybe the other way around. We work with other districts that just like to set aside one-time monies and then basically take the investment earnings off of that, trying not to touch the principal, but again, taking advantage of the growth of their investments over time. And last but not least, again, something that Dennis mentioned during his slides was that reserve cap policy. So for those districts that now have to adhere to that reserve cap of 10% on surplus funds, which was effective for fiscal year 22-23, this is something that school services has recommended as something that your district should think about. I know there's always competing forces in terms of what should happen with surplus funds. Oftentimes, some folks want those to go toward higher salaries or other things within the district. But again, this is a great way to move that money into a dedicated fund where it can only be used for your OPEB and pension costs, and you're really ensuring that's used for that purpose and for no other reason. All right, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of wrap up on the benefits of pre-funding, and really just what I want to reiterate is that I know, although it can be scary to think that you're locking up your funds into this dedicated account, whether it be for OPEB or pension, you can access those monies at any point in time. So when it comes to paying your annual OPEB costs or paying your regularly planned STRS or PERS costs, that money is set aside and there for you when you need it. So you have access to it. It is not going anywhere. In terms of addressing your liabilities, again, so important for districts to start thinking about creating this asset in a 115 trust, whether it's for OPEB or for pension, being able to get the positive benefits of what you can reflect on your balance sheets or in your actuarial valuations. And ultimately, again, giving yourself the opportunity to get a greater rate of return on those monies than you would if they were otherwise sitting in your general fund. Because having the benefits of compounding interest over time help to grow those assets and again, help to increase your pot of money, which is always a good thing. And finally, saving for a rainy day. Again, when we're forecasting what's going to happen in the economy and we're looking at the rates and what's happening here in the state budget, having that dedicated fund that you can tap into in difficult budgetary times is certainly something that your district could benefit from over the long term. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here, and I just have a couple slides outside of the 115 Trust program that I did want to touch upon, and those are covering a SERP, which is also known as a supplementary retirement plan, otherwise known as early retirement incentives. And the reason why I thought it would be timely just to give a brief overview on this concept is because, as we're looking at the budget, talking about possible future recessions, a pending fiscal cliff, which I feel like has been moved back, every couple of years now for us recently. But when you're thinking about difficult budgetary times ahead, this is another tool that you really want to keep in your back pocket that may help your district. This is a tool that I know a lot of districts are starting to look at for various reasons. A lot of declining enrollment across the state, and sometimes that leads to, unfortunately, necessary cuts. You may be facing layoffs, and this may be a way to start thinking about an alternative to layoffs. And so let's start on the next slide, really just talking about cost cutting versus cost saving. So again, these are some things your district might be thinking about when you're looking at difficult budgets ahead. Again, I just mentioned layoffs. We've also seen districts that have had to furlough, potentially eliminate positions altogether. Look at how they can reorganize or reassign certain departments to account for these budget cuts, or step and column freezes, salary schedule reductions, or even increased class size, which I know no one wants to do, but in difficult budgetary times, some districts do have to resort to some of these measures in order to, again, make sure that they're financially stable. So now to flip the switch on this, a SERP is really meant to be the cost savings alternative to cost cutting, and what these measures are on our screen. So as I mentioned, an early retirement incentive is really meant to offer districts the possibility of a cost savings approach that's intended to be a win-win for both you at the district and your employees. It's meant to save you money, but also really promote and incentivize folks that have been with you for a long time to think about taking advantage of sort of a one-time bonus as a thank you for their tenured service to your district, and allow you to retain a lot of those younger employees that you do have. So it's a feel-good program for your employees and a way to save money at the district. So let's go to the next slide here, and I'll give a little bit more of an overview about why you might want to consider this tool. So a SERP is really intended to encourage your long-term employees that oftentimes are at the top of the salary schedule to retire earlier from district service than they otherwise might have planned. And through this, you increase your natural attrition, or the normal number of retirements you get in a given year, often by 2 to 4 times. And so through that acceleration of natural attrition, there's really a great opportunity to see some savings, because ultimately, if your highest salaried employees are moving into retirement and you're able to backfill those positions with some less experienced employees, that salary differential, again, can create a nice little pocket of savings for your district. Ultimately, a district offering an early retirement incentive has full flexibility. And just like I talked about with the 115 Trust, every district across the state has different objectives, and it's no different when it comes to an early retirement incentive. Some districts may just want to target offering this to teachers. A lot of districts offer it to all employees. You have full flexibility in terms of the level of benefit you offer, the employee groups that you offer it to, when you offer it. And so ultimately, I just wanted to stress, without going into too much detail on this call, PARS can offer a complimentary analysis for your district. We typically run different scenarios to show you how the numbers might pencil out to see if this tool is even viable. And we'll tell you if it works in a given year, and we'll tell you if it doesn't work in a given year. So we're very forthcoming to see if this is something that you might want to consider. But again, like to stress that there's an obligation-free look that we can provide to you to make sure that it might meet your fiscal and operational objectives. So again, just something to keep in mind as we go into sort of this uncharted territory of potential budget cuts in the future. Okay, so that was, I know that was a lot of information on my end. So let me open it up here for any questions. And oops, I do see one question here that came through. So access funds at any time with or without penalty. Great question. So someone asked the question, I mentioned being able to access those funds for OPEB or pension at any point in time. Of course, that is without penalty. Yes. So when you set money aside into a 115 trust, those funds are there for whether it be OPEB or pension costs. So if you, for example, have, let's say, $2 million set aside in the trust, and you have, $1 million in a given year that you need to pay out your retiree medical liabilities, you can ask for reimbursement of $1 million back into your general fund and use that to pay your retiree medical costs. There is absolutely no penalty to do that. Again, it's your money and it's there for you when you need it. Good question. All right. Happy to answer any other questions, or again, I'm sure if there are questions that Dennis could answer, he would be glad to do so as well. Do you have to negotiate a freeze and step-in column? That's a great question. And I can't say that I definitively know the answer to that personally. I know it's something that some districts do, but in terms of negotiations and what that looks like, I unfortunately am not the right person to speak to that.
Yeah, it's best to check with your the counsel, your legal counsel on that, because it does take some extraordinary effort to do such a thing. Any other questions? One thing, just to connect with my part of the presentation and Rachel's, when the reserve cap first hit, I don't know, that's probably 6-7 years ago. That's when CSBA became acutely aware of reserves. And right now with reserves, I think at a fairly high level, it's best to really be thoughtful about use of reserves, never be forced to spend reserves because you're at the cap. Make sure that you're thoughtful about it, strategic about it. And everything that Rachel was talking about is a very strategic way to use reserves. And so really be talking about that with your staff. You always have these issues coming before you with it, whether it's healthcare costs or pension costs, they're always out there. That's the one constant we know. You're always going to have those costs. And if you have money now to set aside to help you in the future with some of those, it's really a wise thing to be looking at. So, I mean, that's why we have governmental relations here with PARS, because there is a connection between the two.
Oh, absolutely.
There's some other questions in here for you, Rachel.
Okay, so what is best practice for the percentage reserves a basic aid district should hold?
Wow, that's not for you, is it?
I was going to say, I could take a stab at that, but Dennis, I think you're probably more so the one to try this.
No, and I don't know if there's it's the thing is, the difference between a basic aid / community funded district is you get paid kind of twice a year. I mean, a little bit more than that. And then a funded district that's through LCFF gets apportionments. They get 12 apportionments a year. So, I mean, you just really have to figure out what your cash flow needs are to know how long you need to float. And some of that can be financed through programs. Some of that is just what you have in your reserves. I think the best practices might be if you look at FCMAT, FCMAT.org. That's a public agency that helps school districts and county offices with fiscal issues. You'll know them if you've been in trouble before, but they also have good advice too. So you might reach out there to see if there's some advice that they have for you, but that's a great question.
Absolutely. And Jean asked, who can I call or email to follow up on setting up a 115? Right now we have funds in Fund 71. I can certainly be perfect. Thank you for changing the slide. Feel free to email or call me. I would be happy to chat with you and get you in touch with the right person that works in the area where your district is. So we'll look forward to hearing from you, Jean. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, seeing none, I'll mention that again, if anybody has any specific questions, that you want to ask me about your district or you'd like some more information, again, my contact information is right here. So happy to share, any additional insights I can on anything that I covered today, and certainly appreciate the time and Dennis's expertise in kicking us off. Again, there's a lot of connections that can be made. So I appreciate him setting the stage for us too.
James, I guess we'll hand it back to you.
All right, perfect. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Rachel and Dennis for being our presenters. You guys both did a really good job with all the information. I know it's a lot, but it's very, very, very helpful. CSBA is dedicated to providing up-to-date resources to school board members. To view our recent webinars, please be sure to check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/CSBA video. If you are interested in attending future CSBA webinars, please go to our website at www.csba.org/webinars to register for upcoming webinars. Many thanks to our presenters. And with that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.